Recently, I've been trying out the FX Collection from Arturia, a suite of 15 plugins including preamps, compressors, delays, reverbs and filters, all with a distinctly retro feel. And to be honest, I didn't have a song which deserved it, so I wrote one. Well, half of one. Well, a chorus and a verse. So before we dig in and find out about these plugins, let's see how they sound on this half a song which I wrote only yesterday. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. So you've just been listening to the FX Collection from Arturia applied across a whole song. But now I'm going to delve in a lot deeper and talk about which plugins I use, why I use them and how I use them. So please do stick around for all of that. But before I do get started, I want to say up front that this collection was sent to me by Arturia, but I was not required to say anything specific, nor was this video reviewed before release by anyone but myself. In other words, where I do give an opinion, it's my own opinion, but I've tried to hold off from giving opinions too much in this video. I want you to listen to these plugins and just decide for yourself. Now, before we do get stuck in, if you do like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you're notified about my future videos. Now, let's see how I use these plugins. So I thought I'd start off in the same way that the song does, with the electric guitar. Now the electric guitar has 3 plugins from the collection applied to it, starting off with this preamp, the pre-tried A. Now this is based upon the famous Trident A consoles. Now Trident consoles are famous, I guess, if you're into consoles. If you don't know much about consoles and you've never used them, maybe not so famous, but do think in terms of the Beatles, T-Rex, Queen, Elton John, that kind of thing. Lots of famous albums produced on these consoles, which is probably why they chose to model this plugin on something like that. Now they use a technology, when I say they, I mean Arturia, use a technology called true analog emulation. It's their own technology and it's used to digitally reproduce analog circuits. Now they claim it's spot on, but I can't claim that because I don't have a Trident A console to compare it with. So if you do, maybe you could do an A/B test and make a video out of it. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But anyway, it does add some character, and that's what I used it for. Now let's have a quick listen to this guitar as it came out of the amp sim. I didn't actually mic an amp up. I used an amp sim, but it's the same sort of process. In the real world, you would have microphones on the amp, and those microphones would then be plugged into a preamp. And that's why I use this preamp just after my amp sim plugin, if that makes sense. So let's have a listen to it without. And then I'm just going to switch it on and have a listen so you can hear the sort of subtle difference that I made to it. Now, if you listen carefully, there's a little bit of sort of what I would call bite to it now, and a very slight amount of distortion. Now, if you're not hearing that, Do remember there's a couple of things. First of all, if you're not listening on decent monitors or headphones, then it's less likely you're going to hear a difference. And also, if you're just getting into recording, it takes a little while before your ears really become accustomed to hearing subtleties, because it's a reasonably subtle effect that I've put on there. And also remember, I would have heard this guitar part hundreds of times, got rid of the sound, got used to the sound of it, and then when you add something and make a little change, you tend to zone into it a little bit more. But anyway, what I was aiming for and what I hope you heard was just a little bit of crunch to it. So I did that, first of all, by using the input gain. I just made sure that this needle up here was just getting to around about that 0 area, and that light there, the sort of I think they call it overload light or what have you on a VU meter, it's just flashing there. And now remember, 0 on a VU meter is not the same as 0 on a digital meter that you'll normally see in your DAW. You can go over 0 a little bit on analog equipment, and you'll get some pleasant distortion, you might call it. It's not the same as digital clipping. Anyway, one thing I did like about this is when I use this input control, it didn't, I wasn't wrestling all the time with making sure that the sound of the guitar hadn't become too loud. I'll show you in a moment and it'll make sense. But normally, if I have to add, say, 10 dB of input, and then I make some changes on the EQ, I'm having to adjust the output somewhat. It changes the volume, and we don't really want that. We want to change the sound, not the volume. But have a look at this when I play it. I'm just going to move this input gain up and down, and what you'll hear is the overdrive when I push it all the way at the top, but you won't hear a volume change. Let's have a listen. Here we are all the way down. I'll go up to the top. And it's really overdriving there. So I like that. I like the fact that I can just use that to change the sound, but without actually changing the output volume. So that's a nice thing. And then I worked on using this as an EQ. Now, if you're not used to these types of EQs, the types that you'll see on consoles, I encourage you to give it a go. I'm sure lots of you use EQs which come with your DAW, and you'll see a nice graph and you'll drag nodes around and you'll visually sort of see what you're doing. But these are really good. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos. If you use these, this will help your ears to do the EQing rather than your eyes. Very, very useful, and also give you some sort of knowledge, I guess, about the different frequency ranges and what's going to happen with those. But I actually started off by using a high-pass filter. So a high-pass filter is going to allow high frequencies to pass, sometimes called a low cut. Same thing. Now, that means that I'm actually cutting out a lot of the low frequencies below 50 hertz here. So this just gets rid of a load of stuff that I don't need in the bottom end for this guitar. But sometimes when I use a high pass, I'll just add a little bit in the low mids, and I've done that here. Just added not quite sort of 2 dB there at the 250 hertz range. It's very, very subtle. Probably if I dragged it down, you'd go, can't hear a difference. But as I say, I could hear it because I got used to the sound of the guitar. But where I really added a little bit of sort of bite to this guitar, I guess, using this plugin, was in the top end there. I've got around about a 4, almost 5 dB boost in the 3K range, and then right up to this 12K, very, very high indeed, where it was just sort of, air is. I've actually added a massive 6 to 7 shelf there. It's going to be right up the high end, but I just like the way that sounded. Now, when people are doing EQing, they often talk about, you should only do +3 or +6 at the most. I don't really believe in that. I think you should do as much as sounds good. I don't think there's really rules about that. So, I mean, of course, it is extreme to do 12, 15, but maybe you want extreme sounds sometimes. I digress. So let's just have a quick before and after again. And what I'll do is I'll turn this off, I'll play the guitar, and I'll turn it back on again after a few seconds. And on. Okay, so we'll leave that on, and now we're going to move on to the second plugin which I used on this. Now this was actually on a bus, so I didn't actually have this inline on the guitar. I like to add delays and reverbs on buses rather than have them inline, for reasons which I won't explain now. But I've decided to, on this occasion, you do get 3 different delays in this collection, but I've decided to use this one, which is the Eternity delay. Now, this is a little unusual in the collection in that this is not modeled after some sort of vintage piece of gear. But there was a couple of reasons I used it. First, it just did what I wanted it to do right away, and that was something very simple. And that was to add a kind of a slapback delay to this guitar to add a bit of space to it. So again, let's listen to the guitar without the delay on. And now with the delay, so what I'm doing here is just adding a little bit of space to the guitar so it doesn't sound like it was recorded in a studio, like it might be in a little bit of a space. Now, so I've got the feedback down really, really low, so it just really does 1 repetition of delay for the left and the right. And I've got them, they're very, very short, 32.2 milliseconds there and 45. And what I like to do with this is just have a slightly different value for the left and right. Don't have them the same, actually make them a little bit different. And then that's going to give you a nice sense of space. Now, I've really only used like 10% of the capabilities of this particular plugin. There's a lot more to it, which I haven't fully experimented with, but I'll just give you a brief overview now. First of all, it's got 2 lines, so you can have 2 separate delays with different settings happening, and that happens when you go to the dual mode here. So in dual mode, like I say, it's just like having 2 separate delays working in a parallel fashion alongside each other. And you can also go to serial mode, so that line 2 comes after line 1. So that's a nice little feature just there. I used it in single mode because I just wanted to quickly set up that slapback delay to add a bit of space. I just want to mention as well, I use the re-pitch mode as well for a little bit of pitch change on those delays. I like to do that when I'm trying to create a little bit of a space to an instrument. Now, you can also see the basics, things like filters here, but what I'm going to show you is the kind of advanced mode. Now, with a lot of the plugins in this collection, you will see a little icon on the top right corner, which is the double arrows, and that reveals the sort of more advanced features of that particular plugin. So I'll click it now, and you can see they appear there. Now, I like this. I like this idea. I know it's just a simple and advanced mode. I shouldn't get so excited. But, you know, if I was faced with this when I first looked at the plugin, I'd be, oh, my God, I just want a little bit of delay. It would scare me off. So I like the fact that they sort of hide away some of these advanced features. But what they do reveal to you in there is that we do have some modulation controls over here. So quite a bit of modulation controls, and then some just EQ here on the input. And I should mention as well that another of the features that this delay has is the bit crusher, which I neglected to mention earlier when I was at the top. You can see it here. And this is just a nice way of adding a bit of distortion. Now, in order for you to hear this, I'm just going to add a longer delay to one side here. That's the right-hand side. We'll have a listen. Okay, you can hear that. Now, listen to what happens as I reduce the resolution in this bit crusher. You can hear a lot of distortion there. And you can get similar effects with the down sample. So as you bring them down, there's less resolution. I find the down sampling a little bit more subtle. Have a listen. So there's an awful lot to this particular delay, which I'm not using at all, but it is there just so you know. Now, after the delay, after I've just created that little bit of space, the next thing that I added was the spring reverb, which is this one here. It's called the spring 636, and this is modeled after some old analog gear. Now, a really simple plugin on the face of it, and this is where most of the sound that you're kind of consciously hearing with the guitar is there. So now I must say that I think on the amp sim that I was using, there was a spring reverb in there, and I had listened to it, but I much preferred this. This just, to me, just sounded a little bit more, I'm going to use the word sophisticated, but as sophisticated as a spring reverb gets. Now let's just have a listen to this. I'll switch it on and you'll hear it right away. So that fairly unnatural sounding reverb. Spring reverbs are not, you don't use them to get a natural sounding reverb that you'll get from a room or what have you. They're sort of a stylized reverb, in my opinion. So very few controls here, a bit of an input control, so you can overdrive it and get a little bit of fuzz there. I wanted to keep it reasonably clean there. Simple controls like a long delay. The width here, to make it nice and wide, I elected to go really wide on the stereo range there, and then you sort of mix controls here. Now, there's a nice little detail in here, because if you've ever had a spring reverb, which I've had a few in the past, built into amplifiers, let me know if you've ever tried to move those amplifiers around while you've got it plugged in, and what kind of a sound you get. And I'll remind you by bashing this plugin around, because if you click on this little tag here with your mouse, you will get that sound. Now, you might want to protect your ears a little bit, or I'll try and turn it down a little bit later. This is what it sounds like. Yes, that's the sound. I know. They didn't need to put that there, but they did anyway, hey? That's nice. Now, this also has an advanced mode as well, which we can click on this icon up here to open up the advanced mode, and you can see down here a few things. You've got pre-delay, which I opted not to use, a pre-filter as well, where you can add some nice resonance and change the character of the reverb there. And I'll just hop to the last part, which is the equalizer, a poster equalizer, which I'd already really set up the sound of this guitar so much, and I didn't feel like I needed to change the sound of the reverb as well, but you could use the EQ to that. But I just want to take a look at this middle section here, which is called the tank section. Now, I'd like to tell you that I'm an expert on spring reverbs, and I knew right away exactly what a tank was. But I've got to be honest with you, I was looking at the tank. What's that all about? I didn't know. But, Wikipedia came to the rescue. Now, so what this is really about is that the springs in a spring reverb are contained in a cabinet or a chamber of some kind, and there's different configurations, different sizes, all that kind of stuff. And there's a few sort of fairly famous ones around and less famous ones, and a different tank will change the character of the spring reverb sound. So just so you know, there's a few different ones for you to play with there. I elected to stay with the Gibbs original one, a fairly standard sounding one. They are subtle in their differences, but definitely worth playing around with if you're not quite getting the character that you're expecting. And that is all of the effects for the guitar. So just a quick reminder of how it sounded when I had everything switched off, which I'll do now. And then after adding the preamp, the delay, and the reverb, it sounds like this. And that's it for the guitar. So the next most prominent thing in this track was the lead vocal, and we're going to quickly run through the effects chain with that now. And I do mean quickly, because I've realized this video is getting a little bit long, so I'll just go to the main points of this effects chain. Now, a very quick thank you to Susie, who sung on this. I only told her, or she only learned the song about 10 minutes before she sung it. She sung it with no pitch correction needed, about 1 or 2 takes, and she did it, so good job for her. So let's take a look at the first thing that we've got in the effects chain, and this is this pre-1973 you can see on the screen now. Now, if there's any famous kind of console at all, it would be Neve consoles, and this is based on a Neve console, the 1073. And I've really just used this very, very subtly indeed. If we start off at the top here, I've just added a little bit on the high shelf there. The high shelf on this is fixed at 12 kilohertz, and then I've just added a little bit, again, just 2 dB there right in the middle at 880, or sort of low to middle 880 hertz. And then we have down at the low end at 151 hertz, the biggest boost there, which is the 7 dB boost. And then at the bottom, I've done a low cut of 95 hertz, down below 95 hertz there. So a lot of what's happening there in terms of what you can hear is this low end boost here, which I just used to add a little bit of warmth. So let's have a listen to the dry vocal without anything added at all. Just as Susie sang, it sounded like this.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you.
And then with this pre-clicked on.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you.
So hopefully you can hear just a little bit of warmth there. Again, very, very subtle, but it just adds a tiny bit of thickness. But it was the next phase when I add the compressor where I really added a bit more, or quite a lot more thickness. So I used this plugin here, the VCA65 compressor, and I'm actually using it as a parallel compressor. This is a favorite thing that I do an awful lot of the time. I like to use parallel compression on vocals because I find it's a really easy way to subtly use it without being able to really hear the compression. But if you're not familiar with the technique, ironically, we actually add loads of compression, like loads of compression. If I switch this on and just play that bus which has the parallel compression on it, you'll have a listen.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you.
And you'll hear that that's really, really compressing heavily. That needle's moving around a lot. The threshold's down fairly low. The compression control on this is turned up really high. And it's sort of, it's definitely distorting, but it's a kind of a nice kind of distortion that it works because I have this turned up fairly low on the fader. That's why it sounds quiet to you, because the fader is right down, you know, sort of to about 30% or so. But when you blend that in with the original vocal track, then you get a sort of a thickening effect, or I should say it helps it to remain present. Now, this is based on an old VCA compressor. These were solid state compressors. They don't quite have the same kind of warmth perhaps as tube compressors, arguably, but you do get a little bit more control, and there's quite a lot of controls on this if I click the amazing advanced tab there. And to be quite honest with you, I didn't use any of these controls, but just to make you aware, they are there. Lots of good stuff to play around with there on that compressor. Now, if I blend that back in with the original vocal, it sounds, I've just got to click my things around here, it sounds like this.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you.
So that vocal's starting to sound nice and thick now, which is what I wanted from it. But again, the most notable thing about this when you're really listening as a listener would be the reverb. And you can see here that I've used this plugin in the suite. It's called the Intensity Reverb. I like the name, guys. Good job. Now, the reason I like this is because it's got a really large sound to it, and I really wanted a large sound with this particular vocal. I wanted to kind of mimic the largeness that they would use on those kind of old Motown records, but it's actually sort of refined as well. Now, it's based upon not any specific reverb, I don't think, but sort of a lot of which came out during the 80s or so. I just like the sound of it, kind of its default sound, and it's probably going to be my go-to reverb now. I've used, you know, sort of lexicon reverbs and stuff up to now, but this really is just so nice out of the box. And if I have it switched on, it sounds like this.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you.
Now, normally it wouldn't be quite that large. I like to always have my reverbs on a bus, and then I use the send level to sort of blend it in, and I would probably normally pull back quite a lot from that. but for this particular track, as I say, I liked it. Now, a few sort of basic controls here, some pre-delay, the distance here, but the most notable one is the size. And if I put the size all the way up the top here and play the track again.
Only yesterday, honey.
Wow, you can hear that, can't you?
Only
and then down the bottom.
Yesterday, honey, I was there with you. Only yesterday.
So you're going to do a lot of the control that you need just with this one particular knob, to be honest with you. Then we have a really interesting control here, the damping control. You'll hear what it does. Well, it damps the reverb. So let's have a listen.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you. Only yesterday, honey.
It's almost like the length of it is definitely suppressed, I would say. It's got that sort of, damped effect. And then the width. I had the width on really wide, so it's got a nice big stereo width. Without that, sounds like this.
Only yesterday, honey, I was there with you. Only yesterday, honey.
You can hear it in the tails of that reverb there. You can really hear it in being spread out across the stereo spectrum there. So lots of other controls which I haven't fully explored, to be honest with you. Some modulation controls there which I didn't use. And then the wonderful advanced button up here. If you click that, ping. My goodness, there's a lot to this particular plugin, to be honest with you. There's a lot of things to see there. The only thing that I really used, though, was this pre-filter here. I often use this on reverbs. Nice to see it in there. I don't have to use a separate EQ or anything like that. And this just made sure that I'm only affecting the above 225 hertz there. If you apply reverb to the whole thing, then it can start to get a little bit muddy. So I just like to use it on vocals, just on the top end of the vocals. I didn't use the low pass filter there, and I didn't use the envelope follower. It looks good, doesn't it? There's lots of things that you can push around there. I don't know what they do yet, but it's worth playing around, I guess. Nice to know it's there, should I want it. But I digress already. This plugin did exactly what I wanted it to do, and as I say, it's going to be my go-to reverb, I think, in the future. So as I say, there's 15 plugins in this collection all in all, and I've used around about 8 or 9 of them in this particular song, and I'd like to go through all of them in detail, but there's just no time. So I'm just going to quickly flick through some of the others now for you. The first one I'm going to take a look at here is this V76. This is the third of the preamps here, and I use this on the brass section in a very rudimentary fashion. I just wanted to add quite a lot to the low end there and a little bit of pizzazz on the top end. This brass doesn't really ever do stabs or anything, maybe just borders on stabbing a couple of times, but it's a subtle brass. But I mostly wanted to deal with the low end there with, as I say, a bit of excitement on the top. The other thing that I used on the brass was this tape delay. And again, I just wanted to add a little bit of space to this brass, as if all of those brass players were crammed into quite a small room, actually. I hope they get along, because I only used a very short delay to imply that they were not in a massive hall, but in a kind of a smallish space together. Those poor brass players all crammed in there. And then the next thing I'd like to mention is this compressor, which I used on the bass guitar. This is one of the most famous compressors you're likely to see, this FET 76 here, a FET compressor. You'll have seen this interface all over the place, and that's because it's a really organic, nice to use compressor. Works well for me on this bass, really beefed it up, and definitely worth taking a look at. And the final thing that I want to look at in a little bit more detail was actually the backing vocals. And the first thing I used on the backing vocals, again, was this pre-1973, which you've seen me use before, but previously I used it with the mono version. This time I'm using the stereo version because it's a stereo source. These backing vocals are made up of 4 separate vocals, which all go into a bus, but before that they pan across the sort of stereo spectrum. Now, without this switched on, the backing vocals sounded like this. Thank you, Susie, again. Again, no pitch correction. Well done. Now, with this switch on, you should hear that it sounds quite a bit warmer, and that's because I added absolutely loads to this lower frequency here, around about 151 hertz. I threw in 13 decibels there. That's quite a lot. Just a little bit on the top end of high shaft, not much at all, to add a bit of air to it. But that makes it sound like this.
Ooh, ooh, ooh.
And with it off,
Ooh, ooh, ooh.
sounds quite a lot plain here. So that's the sort of basis I did with the preamp on these vocals. Now I will mention here, it is a stereo plugin. Now at the moment I've got it in the sort of linked mode. Oh sorry, I didn't have it in the linked mode, but if you have it in the unlinked mode, then you can actually operate the channels separately. Linked, any changes you'll make will be reflected on both sides. Not linked, then they act independently of each other. Now that's something I'd quite often do with a stereo source to make it sound a bit wider. The technique basically goes something like this. If you've done something here like boosted it slightly at 934 hertz like I have here, you would actually reduce it slightly on the other channel at exactly the same frequency. And if you do that and play around with doing that, you can actually make it feel a lot wider. As I say, this had a natural width to it, which I'd done with panning, so I didn't need to sort of really add that much more here with the EQ, so I didn't. Now the next thing that I did with these vocals was add some reverb, and I finally finished off using this plate reverb, the third type of reverb, and another unnatural reverb. Just like spring reverbs, plate reverbs are kind of unnatural, and they get their effect by mechanical means. In this case, large plates hanging in such a way that they reverberate and give you a nice sound which has a particular character to it, and that adds this character to these backing vocals. So it's sort of muddier sounding than the previous reverb I used on the main vocals, and I don't mind that at all. That just keeps them a little bit subdued in the background. And there's a few simple controls on here. You can choose to drive it a bit harder. There's some different sort of models there, different decay times that you can do, and your blending controls. And just like some of the other plugins, there is this advanced option here, and I'll just click that and open it. Love the interface, by the way, guys. Good job. And really on this one, I just use a little bit of post equalization, and I just pushed up some of the high ends there. Having said I wanted to keep it a little bit muddy, I've contradicted myself. That's sometimes the way it goes when you're adding effects, and that is the final one of the effects that I'll be looking at today. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to check the link in the description down below. Arturia provide lots of information about each of these plugins, including a manual for each one, and I found those really interesting because they talk about the analog gear which some of these plugins were modeled on, so you can get an idea of the history behind these plugins. Now if you did like this video, make sure you hit the like button, and if you didn't like this video, hit the dislike button twice. If you've got any questions whatsoever, ask in the comments down below, and I'll try my very best to help you out and answer you there. If you do like this kind of content, remember to subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you are notified about my future videos, and I'll see you in the next video.